I knew the HOA was a nightmare, but I never thought they'd outright steal my driveway. It started when I got home from work one evening, only to find a strange SUV parked right in my driveway. Not a friend's car, not a neighbor's, a complete stranger. I honked, waited, and when no one came out, I had to park on the street. Annoying, but I figured maybe someone got lost or mixed up addresses. The next morning, the SUV was still there. I knocked on a few doors, asked around. Nobody knew whose car it was. Frustrated, I called the HOA president, Linda, middle-aged, permanently scowling, and always carrying a clipboard like it was a weapon. Linda, there's a car in my driveway. I don't know whose it is. Can you issue a tow notice? I expected her to be at least semi-helpful. What I got was her nasally, condescending tone. Oh, that's actually allowed now. We've implemented a new policy for overflow parking. I blinked. What? Linda sighed like I was the difficult one. The HOA board voted to allow temporary parking in unused driveways. It prevents street congestion. Your driveway was available, so we assigned it. You assigned my private property? My voice was rising. Linda didn't even pretend to care. It's in the new community guidelines. We sent out an email. I checked my inbox. Sure enough, buried in an HOA newsletter was a vague mention of new parking solutions. No one had explicitly stated they were giving away people's driveways. This is illegal, I said flatly. Oh, it's perfectly legal. You agreed to HOA jurisdiction when you bought your house. I was fuming. Move the car. Linda chuckled. It's only temporary. The owner will move it in a day or two. That was it. I was done. I hung up and immediately called a tow company. If Linda thought she could abuse her little clipboard power, she was about to get a reality check. The tow truck arrived faster than I expected, and the driver wasted no time hooking up the SUV. As I stood there watching, a woman came running down the street, waving her arms frantically. She was in her mid-40s, wearing an expensive-looking blazer and heels that were definitely not made for running. She stopped in front of me, panting. What are you doing? That's my car. I crossed my arms. Your car was parked in my driveway without my permission. It's getting towed. She looked absolutely livid. Linda said I could park here. That told me everything I needed to know. Linda doesn't own my property, I said, keeping my voice even. I do. And I didn't give you permission. She turned to the tow truck driver. You can't take my car. This is HOA-approved parking. The driver, a burly guy with a no-nonsense attitude, barely looked at her. This is private property, lady. Owner called it in. If you want your car, you can pick it up at the impound lot. Her face turned red. You can't do this. I pulled out my phone, already recording. Actually, I can. I'm the homeowner. You trespassed on my property. Feel free to call the cops if you think otherwise. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Clearly, she hadn't expected any resistance. The tow truck pulled out, and her precious SUV disappeared down the street. She stormed off, muttering something under her breath, and I went inside, thinking that was the end of it. I was wrong. The next morning, I woke up to find not one, not two, but 3 cars parked in my driveway. Different makes, different models, all from people I didn't recognize. My blood boiled. Linda was doubling down. I grabbed my phone and called another tow company. This time, I ordered multiple trucks. As I waited, I started gathering evidence. I took pictures of the cars, noted their plates, and even checked my security cameras. Sure enough, in the footage from the previous night, Linda herself could be seen directing the cars into my driveway. That was exactly what I needed. The tow trucks arrived, and one by one, the cars were hauled away. I stood on my porch, arms crossed, as neighbors peeked through their curtains. Linda showed up just as the last car was being hooked up. She marched toward me, her clipboard clutched like a shield. You're violating HOA policy, she snapped. I didn't even blink. No, I'm enforcing property rights. You're the one violating the law. She scoffed. The board approved this. I held up my phone, playing the footage of her directing the cars into my driveway. You mean when you personally orchestrated trespassing on my property? That's all recorded, by the way. For the first time, she hesitated. I took a step closer. I suggest you think very carefully before you say anything else, Linda. Because right now, I have enough evidence to take legal action. Her face twisted, but she didn't argue. She turned on her heel and stormed off. That should have been the end of it. But Linda wasn't done. That night, I got an official violation notice from the HOA. It accused me of unauthorized towing and claimed I owed a fine of $500 per car. I laughed. They were really trying to play this game? Fine. I pulled out my laptop and started drafting a legal response. The HOA had no authority to confiscate private driveways. And now I had evidence of their misconduct. This wasn't just about parking anymore. Now it was war. I wasn't going to let Linda or the HOA get away with this. The violation notice they sent was a joke, but I treated it seriously. I spent the next few hours drafting a response, citing property laws and HOA overreach cases. If they wanted to play games, I was ready to bury them in legal paperwork. The next morning, I walked into the HOA office, a small building near the community entrance that always smelled like cheap coffee and stale air. The receptionist, a younger guy who looked like he wanted to be anywhere else, barely glanced up. I handed him my response. He blinked when he saw the thick packet of documents. I'll give this to Linda. I nodded and left. I wasn't expecting an immediate reaction, but I didn't have to wait long. That afternoon, a notice appeared in my mailbox. An emergency HOA board meeting had been scheduled for the next day. The subject? Community parking adjustments and conduct review. They were coming for me. I spent the evening preparing. I gathered all my evidence, security footage, screenshots of the vague newsletter, copies of my property deed, and legal statutes proving they had no right to seize private driveways. The meeting was held in the clubhouse, a space the HOA used for their events and power plays. By the time I arrived, half the neighborhood was already there. People whispered, clearly curious about the sudden meeting. The HOA board sat at the front with Linda in the center. She had her usual clipboard and a smug expression, like she already thought she'd won. She started with a long-winded speech about community harmony and how some residents were disrupting it by refusing to cooperate with the new parking guidelines. The ridiculousness of it almost made me laugh. Then she turned her gaze on me. "This board has received numerous complaints regarding your actions," she announced, her voice dripping with artificial authority. "Towing vehicles without prior HOA approval, refusing to comply with community standards, and creating unnecessary conflict." She paused, waiting for some kind of reaction. I simply raised an eyebrow. Linda continued. "Effective immediately, you are being fined for each vehicle you removed. Failure to comply will result in further disciplinary actions, including potential legal consequences." I let the room sit in silence for a moment before I spoke. "You're bluffing." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Linda's expression flickered, but she quickly recovered. "Excuse me." I stepped forward, setting my neatly organized stack of documents on the table in front of her. "This is a formal legal response to your violation notice. I've outlined in detail how the HOA has overstepped its authority. I've also included recorded evidence of your direct involvement in trespassing on private property." Linda's fingers tightened around her clipboard. I kept going. "You see, the HOA has jurisdiction over common areas, not private driveways, not individually owned property. You don't get to assign my driveway to strangers, and you definitely don't have the authority to fine me for enforcing my property rights." Linda opened her mouth, but I wasn't finished. "Furthermore, I've checked the HOA bylaws. Nowhere does it say the board can unilaterally change property usage without a community vote. You slipped that new parking solution into a newsletter without properly notifying homeowners or holding a vote, which legally invalidates it." The room was dead silent. Even the other board members looked uneasy. I turned slightly, addressing the rest of the attendees. "How many of you actually agreed to this driveway parking policy?" A few hands rose. "Not many." "And how many of you even knew about it before this whole mess started?" Almost no hands. That was the final nail in the coffin. Linda's face was pale now, but she tried one last desperate move. "Regardless, the board has the authority to issue fines." I shook my head. "Not unlawfully. And if you try to enforce this, I'll take legal action. I already have a lawyer reviewing this, and I'm prepared to file a lawsuit. Not just against the HOA, but personally against you, Linda, for overstepping your authority and facilitating trespassing." The color drained from her face. I turned to the other board members. "If you continue pushing this, Every homeowner affected by these illegal changes will have grounds to sue. Is that something you really want to deal with? The board members exchanged nervous glances. One of them cleared their throat and spoke hesitantly. Perhaps we should review the policy again. Linda's jaw clenched, but she saw the writing on the wall. She wasn't going to win this fight. I stood there, arms crossed, as the board members whispered among themselves. Finally, one of them turned back to the room. We'll suspend the new parking policy until further review. I smiled. Good choice. Linda looked like she had swallowed a lemon, but she couldn't argue. As the meeting ended and people began filing out, several neighbors came up to me, shaking my hand and thanking me for standing up to the HOA. Linda, meanwhile, stormed out without another word. I knew this wasn't over. People like her didn't back down so easily. But for now, I had one. And I was more than ready for whatever she tried next. The storm hadn't passed. If anything, Linda was only regrouping. I knew someone like her wouldn't swallow a public humiliation without trying to retaliate. The problem was I didn't know how she'd attempt it. 2 days after the emergency HOA meeting, I got my answer. I woke up to a certified letter taped to my door. That was already unusual. Most HOA notices came through email or in a standard envelope. This wasn't just another fine, it was something worse. I tore it open and scanned the document. My eyebrows lifted as I read. The HOA was claiming I was in violation of community upkeep standards. Specifically, they were accusing me of excessive wear and tear on my driveway and stating that I had 30 days to repair it or face escalating fines. I stepped outside and took a good, long look at my driveway. It was concrete, solid, and well-maintained. There were no cracks, no damage, nothing that could remotely justify a violation. Linda had found her new angle. She knew she couldn't win the parking battle, so now she was trying to financially bleed me through fabricated maintenance violations. That wasn't going to happen. I took out my phone and snapped a dozen high-resolution photos of my driveway from every angle. I even recorded a video, ensuring I had documented proof of its pristine condition. Then, I contacted a local contractor and asked for a professional inspection. By the afternoon, the contractor arrived, clipboard in hand. He walked the length of my driveway, checked for any issues, and eventually shook his head. "This is one of the cleanest driveways I've seen," he said. "There's absolutely nothing wrong here. If they're saying you need repairs, they're lying." That was exactly what I needed to hear. I had him draft an official inspection report complete with photographs and a signed statement verifying there was no structural damage. Then I attached it to an email and sent it directly to the HOA board, CCNG Linda. I kept the message short and to the point. There is no damage to my driveway. Attached is a professional assessment proving this violation is unfounded. Any further attempts to fabricate fines will be considered harassment and handled accordingly. Linda didn't respond. But the next morning I walked outside to find a bright orange notice stuck to my garage door. It was another violation. This time, they accused me of improper landscaping maintenance. I stared at the notice, then looked at my yard. My lawn was trimmed, my bushes neatly pruned, and my flower beds free of weeds. There was nothing out of place. Linda was grasping at straws, hoping I'd get tired of fighting back. I wasn't. I repeated the same process, took pictures, got a landscaper to inspect my property, and had them draft a report confirming there were no violations. I sent another email attaching the new report. This time, I added a legal notice at the bottom stating that if they continued issuing fraudulent violations, I would be filing a formal complaint with the State Homeowners Association Oversight Committee. That finally got a response. Linda sent a curt reply stating that the board would review the matter further. But I wasn't waiting for their review. That evening, I knocked on a few doors and started talking to my neighbors. As it turned out, I wasn't the only one getting these bogus violation notices. Several other homeowners had received sudden fines for non-existent infractions, cracks in sidewalks that weren't there, faded paint that wasn't actually faded, and even reports of unsightly trash bins when the bins had been properly stored. Linda was trying to financially intimidate the community into submission. So I proposed something radical, a recall vote. HOA board members could be removed if enough homeowners voted them out. It wasn't easy, but it was possible. I spent the next week rallying the neighborhood. I gathered signatures, organized a meeting, and presented the case. People were frustrated, tired of Linda's power games. and they were ready for change. The recall vote was scheduled for the following month. Linda must have caught wind of it because suddenly, she changed tactics. She started knocking on doors, pretending to be friendly, trying to convince people that I was the troublemaker. She claimed I was a disruptive influence, and that my actions were hurting property values. But the damage had already been done. People had seen her corruption firsthand. They knew who the real problem was. When the recall vote finally happened, the results were overwhelming. Linda was removed from her position, along with 2 other board members who had supported her schemes. The HOA was forced to roll back the fraudulent fines, and new board members were elected ones who actually listened to the community instead of ruling it like a dictatorship. As for Linda, she moved out a few months later, unable to handle the humiliation of her defeat. And my driveway? It remained exactly where it belonged, mine. Linda's removal didn't mean the HOA's problems disappeared overnight. Corruption like that didn't just vanish, it left scars. And those scars ran deep in the neighborhood. The new board had its hands full trying to untangle the mess she left behind. And even though I had one, I wasn't about to let my guard down. The first sign that things weren't fully settled came in the form of an anonymous letter slipped under my door a week after the recall vote. No envelope, no return address, just a single sheet of paper with a hastily scrawled warning. You made a mistake. Watch yourself. I stared at the note, turning it over in my hands. It was vague, but the intent was clear. Someone wasn't happy about Linda's downfall, and they wanted me to know it. If they were hoping to intimidate me, they had picked the wrong person. I went inside, placed the letter on my desk, and pulled up the footage from my security cameras. The motion sensors had triggered around 3 in the morning. The grainy nighttime video showed a shadowy figure approaching my porch, slipping the letter under the door, and then hurrying off into the darkness. Their face wasn't visible, but their shape and gait suggested a man, possibly in his 40s or 50s. I wasn't about to let this slide. Instead of reacting immediately, I took my time. I printed out stills from the footage and started asking around. I spoke to neighbors, the new board members, even the mail carrier who had been working the neighborhood for years. No one recognized the figure, but that didn't mean much. Whoever this was, they had experience being discreet. The real breakthrough came when I ran into George, an older resident who had lived in the community for over 2 decades. He had a way of noticing things other people overlooked, and when I described the figure's movements, a knowing look crossed his face. That sounds like Frank, he said. I frowned. I had never heard of a Frank. George leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. Used to be on the HOA board years ago. Linda forced him out when she took control. He didn't take it well. Kept to himself after that. But he's always lurking around, acting like he still has power. That was interesting. If Frank was involved, that meant Linda's influence hadn't completely faded. There were still remnants of her rule lingering in the shadows, waiting for an opportunity to strike back. I decided to press my luck and pay Frank a visit. His house was at the far end of the neighborhood, nearly hidden behind overgrown hedges and a rusted gate that looked like it hadn't been opened in years. I knocked, waited, and eventually the door creaked open just a crack. A pair of sharp, suspicious eyes peered out at me. What do you want? I held up the printed image from my security footage. I think we need to talk. Frank didn't deny it was him. He didn't even blink. Instead, he exhaled sharply and stepped back, leaving the door open just enough for me to follow inside. His house was cluttered but organized, stacks of old HOA documents piled high on nearly every surface. It was clear he had never really let go of his time on the board. I got straight to the point. Why did you leave that note? Frank didn't answer right away. Instead, he shuffled to a chair, sat down, and laced his fingers together. You think because Linda's gone, everything's fixed? I didn't answer. Frank snorted. She wasn't the only one keeping this HOA running like a kingdom. There are others. People who don't want things to change. That caught my attention. Who? Frank leaned back, studying me. You're smart. You'll figure it out. I was starting to lose patience. If you wanted to help, you could have just told me. Instead, you left a warning like some back alley thug. For the first time, Frank's expression softened, just slightly. I didn't know if you were the kind of person who'd listen. I crossed my arms. And Frank let out a slow breath. Maybe you are. He didn't give me names, but he gave me something better, a list of addresses. These are the people who helped Linda stay in power, he said. Some of them are still trying to pull strings behind the scenes. If you really want a clean house, start there. I took the list and left, my mind already spinning with possibilities. The fight wasn't over, not yet. Linda might have been the face of the corruption, but she hadn't acted alone. There were still holdouts, people clinging to the old ways, hoping to regain control. They had made one miscalculation. I wasn't going anywhere. I left Frank's house with my mind racing. The list of addresses he had given me wasn't just a collection of names, it was a roadmap to the people who had enabled Linda's reign. People who had kept their hands clean while she did the dirty work. And now that she was gone, they were waiting for their moment to reclaim control. I wasn't going to let that happen. The next morning, I started knocking on doors. Some of the names Frank had given me were familiar board members who had resigned quietly when Linda was recalled. Others were neighbors I barely knew, people who had stayed out of the spotlight but had clearly been involved behind the scenes. At first, I played it casual. I asked questions, made conversation, acted like I was just another homeowner concerned about the state of the community. But the more I talked, the clearer it became there was still a power struggle happening, just beneath the surface. Some of them had plans to reinstate old policies. Others were still trying to enforce Linda's absurd fines, hoping they could pressure the new board into compliance. And then there were the ones who didn't say much at all, but whose silence was louder than words. By the afternoon, I had a clear picture of what was happening. The HOA might have been restructured, but there were still people pulling strings in the background, hoping to undermine everything we had fought for. I wasn't about to let that happen. I gathered the evidence, recorded conversations, documents Frank had given me, even emails that had been forwarded to me by board members who wanted no part in the scheme. Once I had everything, I requested an official homeowners meeting. Not just a board meeting, a full community gathering where every resident had a say. The meeting was scheduled for the weekend, giving me just enough time to prepare. I spent every spare moment strategizing, making sure I had every detail ready. If these people wanted to play games, I was going to make sure they lost. When the day of the meeting arrived, I walked into the clubhouse with a thick folder of evidence and a quiet determination. The room was packed, more people than I had expected, all murmuring amongst themselves, clearly curious about what was happening. The new HOA president, a reasonable man who had taken over after Linda's removal, called the meeting to order. He looked at me expectantly, giving me the floor. I didn't waste time. I laid everything out: how certain individuals were still trying to enforce Linda's old rules, how they had been pressuring the board behind the scenes, how they were hoping to regain control through intimidation and manipulation. I presented the evidence: emails, recordings, documents. I named names. The room went silent as people absorbed what I was saying. Then the anger started to build. Homeowners who had thought the corruption was gone realized it had merely shifted. People who had been relieved after Linda's removal now saw that the fight wasn't over. And then something incredible happened. One by one, people started standing up. They spoke out, sharing their own experiences: suspicious fines, strange conversations, whispered threats about what would happen if they didn't cooperate. It wasn't just me. The entire neighborhood had been affected, and now that the truth was out, they weren't going to stay silent. The people who had been trying to regain control realized they had lost. There was no coming back from this. By the end of the meeting, the community had voted to permanently remove anyone involved in the scheme from any future HOA positions. Policies were put in place to prevent similar abuses of power. Transparency was enforced. And just like that, the last remnants of Linda's regime crumbled. As I walked out of the clubhouse, the weight of the past few months finally lifted. The HOA had tried to take my driveway. They had tried to intimidate, manipulate, and control. But in the end, they had failed. And the neighborhood was finally free.